Exactly.
We don't say that about the libertarian free will of criminals or child torturers and so on. It's just when the problem of evil is raised that all of a sudden free will becomes so valuable that not even God may ever curtail it, and never mind what the Bible says about his having done so.
Well, I think you've hit the nail on the head there. I think that's a serious problem for theists, and I'm glad you've got some work on it.
So a second objection to my argument from morality to atheism is this: contrary to what I've said, a perfect God is allowed to exploit people, including children, because they owe their existence to God, and God is, on balance anyway, their benefactor.
Right.
Richard Swinburne is the figure most associated with this kind of objection, and I reject it. So suppose I clone a child into existence, so we're looking at future technology, and I'm good to the child for all but the final minute of its life. But during that final minute, I allow it to be tortured to death in order to show others just how revolting child torture is, and thereby discourage them from engaging in child torture.
Well, gee, that would be awfully good of you.
That's the idea. My exploitation of the child would be monstrous. It would be at least morally imperfect behavior, even though it owes its existence to me, and I was, on balance, let us suppose, its benefactor. I treated it very well for all but the last minute of its life. Even so, I'm not off the hook for exploiting it during that last minute. So I reject Swinburne's reply to the argument.
Are there other objections that you hear?
Another objection I sometimes hear is that it's enough to justify God's exploitation of a tortured child if God redeems the child's suffering. Now, redeems is the word the objector typically uses, but I'm not sure it's the right word. In any case, what's meant by the objection is that it's enough to justify God's exploitation if God later compensates the tortured child with heavenly bliss. And I think this objection simply confuses two very different things, compensation and justification. If I run you over in my car, the law may force me to compensate you afterward, but that compensation hardly justifies what I did to you in the first place. They're just two very different things. No amount of compensation and no amount of forgiveness on the part of the victim constitutes a justification for the original exploitation.
Yeah.
So I think this redeems business is not persuasive. I think it's just a confused reply to my argument. Another objection is this: for all we know, God is sometimes forced to exploit children in order to avoid something even worse. Now, in that case, I would still say God's perfection is threatened. I would say that because, well, we human beings may face genuine moral dilemmas, cases in which we can't avoid doing something wrong because our options are constrained. We're limited beings.
Mm-hmm.
But it seems to me that God would face a moral dilemma only if moral dilemmas are built into the metaphysical fabric of every possible universe, or at least the fabric of the best possible universe. And I can't see how they could be. I can't see God facing a moral dilemma unless moral dilemmas are metaphysically basic, and I can't see how they could be.
Yeah, and I'm hearing Plantinga arguing now that you can't prove that moral dilemmas aren't metaphysically basic.
Right, and maybe it comes down to a question of which of us bears the burden of proof. I'm assuming that if God does face a moral dilemma, then moral dilemmas are metaphysically basic. Now the question becomes whether to believe that moral dilemmas are metaphysically basic, and I think the burden of proof is on someone who says that this is part of the metaphysical fabric of the universe. Why should we suppose that it is? It's an attempt to add an item to the list of metaphysically basic facts about the universe, and I think the burden of proof is on whoever wants to add that item.
Yeah, and I think one way to avoid having to hash out whether or not something is metaphysically basic would to just say, well, even if it's possible, it seems very unlikely, and therefore, despite your objection about this possible world where moral dilemmas are metaphysically basic, your argument would still constitute strong evidence against the existence of an all-perfect God.
Yeah, I think we could certainly cast it in those terms.
Well, switching gears a little bit, as an atheist doing philosophy of religion, you're in the minority. So what does the field of philosophy of religion look like from your perspective?
Well, it looks too important to leave it all to theists. In my course, we get to study the most important issue that there is. I tell them if you throw a dart at the newspaper, chances are good that you'll hit a story in which religion is the driving force behind the story. And I tell them that the contemporary importance of religion and philosophy of religion is totally contrary to what the experts were predicting some decades ago. I trot out the famous quotation from Harvey Cox, the Harvard theologian, who wrote a book called The Secular City in 1965, and he predicted in that book that religion would soon disappear from the public sphere, never to return. And it might have been a fair prediction from his perspective, but it's turned out to be spectacularly wrong. Religion is as important today as it perhaps ever has been. Well, I try to organize this course around arguments that seem to me actually to motivate ordinary belief and non-belief in God, and those tend not to be, the ontological, cosmological, or teleological arguments even in my experience. Instead, to the extent to which arguments motivate believers at all, it's arguments about such things as the ultimate meaning of life and arguments about the basis for morality. Those are the really motivating kinds of arguments, as Christian apologists such as Craig recognize and capitalize on. So those are the topics that we tend to concentrate on for the most part in that course.
What is it that you would have to say as an atheist about the meaning of life and morality?
The work I've been doing so far has been meant to combat this widespread misimpression that atheism is bad for morality, and instead to turn the tables a bit and argue that theism is in fact the real threat to morality. Where ultimate meaning of life is concerned, I give a rather different answer that I think I'm borrowing from Thomas Nagel, and that's simply the idea that the notion of ultimate purpose or ultimate meaning is incoherent. It can be shown to be impossible on conceptual grounds alone, and so we should stop seeking it, and we should not be disappointed with the discovery that we can't achieve it because it is a conceptually confused idea.
And so what's the idea of ultimate meaning that you're talking about, and why is it incoherent?
As I understand it, if you read people like, again, William Lane Craig, they object to atheism because it provides no ultimate purpose for our lives. No matter how noble the purpose to which you devote your life, unless God exists, that purpose can be made to seem trivial or fleeting or relative, unless God exists. So what Craig is evidently looking for is a purpose for life that is ultimate in the sense that it's unquestionable. It would make no sense to question it. It would make no sense to wonder what's so great about that purpose. It's a purpose that can't be diminished no matter how far back from it you step.
Mm-hmm.
And this is where Nagel comes in a 1971 article called The Absurd. At least as I interpret that article, he argues that that kind of ultimate purpose is in principle unattainable, because as soon as you understand any alleged purpose that we might have for our lives, you thereby become able to question it and step back from it and ask what makes it so great and why that is sufficient as our ultimate purpose. So you're, on the one hand, seeking a purpose that you cannot sensibly question, and on the other hand, if it's to serve as your purpose, you're going to have to understand it to some degree, but as soon as you understand it, you thereby become able to question it and therefore render it non-ultimate. Ultimate purpose cannot be had on conceptual grounds alone because the concept is incoherent. So what Craig is requiring can't be had, and what he is saying theism offers cannot be had.
Well, and I think the idea here is, let's say I say that my purpose is to decrease suffering and increase the peace on the planet. And the theist could come back and say, well, why think that really matters? How could that be the ultimate purpose? And the theist thinks that he has a better answer because he can say, well, the reason my purpose is to reduce suffering on earth is because that's what the God of the universe told me to do, and so that's why that's my ultimate purpose. But then we can just as well say, well, why is that an ultimate purpose? Why should you obey this God character?